In the decades around 1200 BC, the palatial empires that ruled the eastern Mediterranean world began to falter. In that disorder, opportunistic bands of warriors, pirates, and raiders preyed upon coastal settlements with impunity. The destruction these so-called Sea Peoples brought is now infamous. But a century and a half before the Sea Peoples, they were the less famous Men of Arwad and the Miši men. While these groups are not Sea Peoples per se, when we examine the textual evidence contemporary with them, they seem to behave in a very similar manner to the Sea Peoples, except they operated in a time prior to the collapsing of the Bronze Age empires. And they appear almost like Proto Sea Peoples, groups that set the precedent and established the pattern the Sea Peoples would later follow. So who were these groups, and how did they pave the way for the Sea Peoples? Let's dig in. The Men of Arwad, or the Ships of Arwad, are mentioned in 5 different Amarna letters. The Miši men are likewise mentioned in 6 letters, with 2 of these letters overlapping. And before we can try to understand who these people are and what their role may have been in the Eastern Mediterranean world, it's worth looking at the letters where they're referenced to get some context. Now, it's important to note these are not in chronological order, so the events in the letters may not make sense as a sequence of events. We'll be going through the references in order of the letter notation, as the actual chronological order of the Amarna letters is much disputed. In EA 98, a letter written to Yapahada, the mayor or governor of Beirut, the pharaoh is annoyed with his vassal that all the land north of him has become disloyal, and Beirut has not intervened against the ships of the men of the city of Arwad, who have been blocking shipments of grain from getting to the Egyptian fortress of Sumer. The letter designated EA 101 is the second tablet of what was originally a 2-tablet letter, and the first part, including who sent it and to who it was addressed, is missing. This, in addition to some translation issues, has made this letter the focus of a fair bit of academic debate. Now, thankfully, the various translations and interpretations that have been posited don't impact our specific interest in this letter too significantly. And what we can tell with some confidence is the immediate context of the letter is the death of the Amorite warlord Abdi-Ashirta. But again, depending on how it's translated, we may reconstruct that history quite differently. Most scholars suggest this letter originated with Ribhada, the mayor of Byblos, who provides us with a lot of commentary on what was occurring in Amurru. A petrographic analysis of the letter also strongly points to it being Biblian in origin. As far as the various ways of translating this text, they're all pretty reasonable. There isn't a particular grammatical or syntactic reason to favor one reading over the other, given both the fragmentary nature of the tablet and the difficulties in translating Amarna-era Akkadian. And our presumption is whoever carried the letter to its destination, in this case to the pharaoh, would have clarified any ambiguity, but we don't have that, so we're left with parsing out all the various possibilities on our own. So for example, it is possible to see that the Egyptian vizier, Haya, is accused of working against the interests of the pharaoh. Or, it could be that he was absolved of guilt of working against the pharaoh. It's also not clear if the Miši were the ones who killed Abdi-Ashirta or if his own men did. And also it's not clear what role Mitanni plays in the whole episode. Did Abdi-Ashirta not have the funds to secure protection from Mitanni? Or did Mitanni instigate the Miši to enter Amurru and kill Abdi-Ashirta? The author also indicates the ships of Arwad were at war with him, but also that the ships of Arwad are in Egypt. The issue here being that Byblos was a loyal vassal of Egypt, so why should Byblos be fighting off ships of Arwad while ships of Arwad are safely anchored in Egypt? So, for all the various ways of interpreting this particular letter, a few key takeaways include the Miši men were in the service of Pharaoh or his representative. They may or may not have been serving the interests of Pharaoh, and that ships of Arwad were both in Egypt and fighting against an Egyptian vassal in Byblos. This situation is different in EA 104 and 105. In EA 104, Arwad is stated as being aligned with Amurru in their attack against Byblos. In EA 105, Ribhada states the Egyptian fortress of Sumer is besieged by Amurru by land and is supported by the people of Arwad by sea. These ships are said to have intercepted an aid shipment sent by Byblos to Yanhamu, the Egyptian commander in the area. Even more, Rib Hada adds these men of Arwad have taken the ships of the Miši men together with everything belonging to them, and I am unable to go to the aid of Sumer. So here, the ships of the Miši men have been intercepted by Arwad in aid of the Amorite war effort against Sumer and the Egyptian garrison there. In EA 108, the Miši men are accused by Rib Hada of aiding Amuru. The tides apparently turned in favor of Abdishirta, and so the Miši men were supplying Amuru with no fear of reprisals from the Egyptian officials in the region. The Miši men's role as suppliers is further noted in the letters EA 110, 111, and 126. In EA 110, a very fragmentary letter which has been reconstructed in various ways is again from Rib Hada. In it, the mayor asks for provisions the Miši men are transporting, provisions belonging to the king. EA 111, again, is fragmentary, but it relays an ostensibly dire situation where the region is falling to the lawless Apiru and Miši men are involved in transporting supplies in the region. EA 126 is much longer, but its accusations against the Miši men are quite clear. Here the Miši men are said to be transporting the pharaoh's silver and gold and giving it to Amuru, who he says is in turn giving it to the Hittites. Something which may not be entirely inaccurate given that Amuru switched their allegiance from Egypt to the Hittites around this time. The accusation here being the Amorites paid for their vassal treaty with the Hittites with the pharaoh's gold given to them by the Miši men. The final source is EA 149. Here the mayor of Tyre is reporting to Pharaoh about an impending assault on his city. He accuses Sidon, and the men of Arwad is entering into an oath to work together against Tyre. Now, what do we make of these two groups, the men of Arwad and the Miši men? And in what ways are they like Proto Sea Peoples? First, let's look at the men and the ships of Arwad. Arwad was a city on an island approximately 2.5 kilometers off the Syrian coast. It is mentioned in the text from Imar and Alalak, and so we can surmise it was occupied in presumably an important port since the early Bronze Age. It's not clear if it controlled an agricultural hinterland on the mainland in its early history, but when Thutmose III campaigned into Syria in the 15th century, the agricultural land on the coast fell securely within the orbit of Egyptian influence. Egypt then promoted Sumer and to a lesser extent Ulasa as the primary ports on the coast, which no doubt damaged Arwad's standing as a significant commercial center. And Sumer and Ulasa could serve not only as maritime entrepôts, but also as gateways into inland Syria as they were situated near the Holmes Gap. So by the 14th century, Arwad was becoming increasingly marginalized. Further, by the 14th century, Arwad seems to be organized in a unique way, in that there was no indication of a king in the city. In all the Amarna Letters, the references to Arwad are either to just the city, or to the men of Arwad or the ships of Arwad. In fact, in EA 149, it is the men of Arwad who enter into military treaty with the city of Sidon. If a king had been in charge, it is likely they would be referenced here. And this has led many scholars to suggest there simply was no monarchy in Arwad during the 14th century, and that a different kind of government ruled. But what kind of government is not clear. Suggestions of some proto-republican government may stretch the evidence. Instead, the city seems to be represented by its maritime activities, the men of the ships of Arwad, or the ships of Arwad. So some more egalitarian form of governance, like a council of elders that was emergent from their naval and maritime structure, is often hypothesized. Something where ship captains served as counselors or elders who made decisions together seems plausible, but again, this is pretty speculative as to what the men of Arwad may refer to. As a politically marginalized entity composed of skilled mariners, Arwad turned to being what Michal Artzi has called economic mercenaries. She describes an environment where the skilled mariners and merchants of the eastern Mediterranean littoral were engaged as middlemen and intermediaries within the economic system and acted on behalf of the larger economic forces in the region. However, when the economic system was no longer favorable, they could use those particular set of skills they had developed over a very long career of traversing the Mediterranean and turn to brigandry and piracy. Archie notes it was when the economic world shifted, these same people reverted to marauding practices and the image of sea peoples, familiar to us from Egyptian sources, emerged. In the case of Arwad, the data point to them engaging in merchant activity as the king of Byblos states the ships of Arwad were in Egypt. but they simultaneously engaged in piracy. Their commercial role diminishes over time. Eventually, they seem to serve as the naval arm of Amuru, which, though it had a ferocious army, it did not have a strong naval heritage. The Amarna Letters suggest Arwad and Amuru found a mutually beneficial arrangement in raiding Egyptian commercial interests in Syria. And while this may have begun as a pairing between equals, each contributing a necessary component in their resistance, over time Amuru became the dominant partner, as attested in a treaty between Amuru and Ugarit where Arwad goes entirely unmentioned, leading many scholars to assume Arwad had been fully brought into the orbit of Amuru as a client state by that time. As for the Miši men, their identity is a bit more difficult to disambiguate. The term mesh is known from elsewhere in Egyptian sources where it means army or soldiers. The term under discussion here is Miši. Etymologically, these two terms have been linked, such that Miši men has been understood as the naval arm of the Egyptian army. The term is consistently connected with maritime transport and is most often at the command of the pharaoh or his emissary in the region. However, they are clearly not always loyal to Egypt, which suggests they may not have been the Egyptian navy. In fact, some scholars have noted it's surprising we don't actually have more references to the Egyptian navy in the Amarna Letters. If they were not actually Egyptian, but Syrians or other Levantine peoples who acted on behalf of the Egyptians, their episodes of disloyalty may make some more sense. Mikhail Artsy has again suggested they were a de facto Egyptian coast guard, local mariners who acted as logistics contractors for the Egyptian army. There are in fact several references in both Egyptian literature and the Amarna Letters which indicate the polities on the Levantine coast provided ships for Egypt as part of their owed tribute. It's possible this meant they supplied and outfitted ships to patrol local waters on Egypt's behalf. Alternatively, some scholars have suggested the Miši were not Syrians who were working on behalf of Pharaoh, but Aegean mercenaries. But this begs the question if there were even any Aegean mercenaries in the eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age, and if so, did Egypt employ them? For the first question, we can look to the vassal treaty between the Hittite king Tutolia IV and Shashkamua, the king of Amuru, which includes a provision where the king of Amuru is prohibited from permitting ships from Ahiyawa from going to Assyria, Assyria being a rising threat to Hittite interests in Syria and Mesopotamia. While this may simply be an economic embargo, many scholars take this to be a reference to a prohibition on ships bearing mercenaries from Ahiyawa, which is in the Aegean. The Hittite king would likely not be concerned with shipments of oil and fine ceramics getting to Assyria, but he may take particular issue with skilled mercenaries, with experience fighting the Hittites no less, showing up on his eastern border and not just his west. So the existence of Aegean mercenaries in the eastern Mediterranean has been postulated and is generally accepted. As to the second question, a very fragmentary papyrus may even depict Mycenaean mercenaries fighting alongside Egypt. Dating to the 18th dynasty, this papyrus may show Aegean mercenaries wearing boar tusk helmets fighting Libyans alongside Egyptian soldiers. These kinds of helmets are attested not only in Homeric tradition, but have been excavated in Mycenaean shaft graves. The archaeologically recovered examples bear a striking resemblance to those shown in the papyrus. While this may not be particularly strong evidence, it has been used to support the assertion Egypt not only was in regular contact with the Aegean, but employing Aegean mercenaries during at least part of the Late Bronze Age. Now, what may make the most sense of the evidence is that Miši is a term devoid of ethnic or geographic significance and is instead an administrative or military term, naval soldiers in the employ of Egypt. This leaves room for their ethnic or tribal affiliation to be non-Egyptian, which may also account for the shifting allegiance noted in some of the sources. Though many scholars do point out that even if these soldiers were Egyptians serving in the Egyptian navy, it's not unreasonable to see them as willing to advance their own interests whenever possible, even at the expense of the pharaoh. However, the suggestion they were Levantine or Aegean serving as mercenaries for Egypt may better account for their willingness to turn on the pharaoh. Now, one final note is that the term may be something that was peculiar to Byblos, as the term is only ever used in letters originating in Byblos, so perhaps the same group is referred to by another name in other sources. While the Miši men and the Men of Arwad at first glance may appear to be quite different, they actually have a fair bit in common. The snapshot we get in the mid-14th century shows us two groups of mariners participating in different parts of the same economic system. The Men of Arwad were more peripheral, and as we see already had a reputation for being prone to brigandry and marauding. The Miši men were more closely aligned with Egypt, at least officially, but that alignment was apparently up for negotiation when that loyalty got even slightly inconvenient. When they no longer benefited from their role in the economic world, they too reverted to raiding and piracy. It turns out, they were just ahead of the curve. A century and a half later, the Sea Peoples would follow in their footsteps. Textual sources indicate several groups of the Sea Peoples served as mercenaries for various late Bronze Age empires before they coalesced into a coalition of their own. Unlike the Men of Arwad or the Miši men, though, they would find themselves not just shifting roles within an economic system they found ill-suited, but attempting to escape the collapse of the system itself.